When chaos breaks loose on the flight deck, your proficiency and your procedures are what everything is going to boil down to. Today we're going to talk about that in the hangar. Josh Flowers here from Aviation101. I'm here guest hosting this episode of In the Hangar, which is sponsored by Gold Seal Flight Training and iFly GPS. Today I've got Martin, Doug, and my dad, Bob, here on In the Hangar. We're going to talk about proficiency, procedures, and all that kind of stuff about accident prevention and what we as aviators in the community can do. Martin, you're a CFI up in Iowa, and Doug, you're a DPE up in Iowa. And my dad here is a private pilot, longtime private pilot, just about to take your instrument check ride. So I think we've got some interesting perspectives to talk about here. So Doug, let's start with you. You actually made a comment to me earlier regarding proficiency and procedures. It was a saying that I've never heard before, and it made a lot of sense. Could you go ahead and deliver that for us and tell me your thoughts on that?
Well, especially in multi-engine training, I teach a phrase that kind of sticks in people's mind as it did with you, and it's called ritual makes sense out of chaos. And so as pilots, we think we rise to the occasion, but we don't. We sink to the level of our most recent recurrent training. And so we have to have rituals that fall back on when we're in that cone of confusion that help us go from here 2 inches at 2,000 yards to getting our vision back and some situational awareness and become a functioning member of the flight crew again.
Absolutely. I think you just said something that kind of strikes a nerve with me, which is recurrent training. As a CFI, a flight instructor, I love the idea of recurrent training and how we can change it ourselves as flight instructors and as pilots in the community to make it more effective for us to be safer aviators, basically. And I know that earlier when we were discussing this, you said your thinker turns off. And it's just like the push to talk button. That's your brain disconnect button. The same thing happens when chaos happens on the flight deck, I think. As soon as that happens and you're thrown out of your rhythm, you stop thinking, and you kind of lose that ability to think freely, like you were saying.
In an emergency, you take a shot of adrenaline, and that just turns off your brain. You go into the fight or flight mode, and you're not going to reason well. You're not going to think. You're not going to make good decisions. And so that's where recurrent training and procedures that you have trained and practiced to a successful outcome become so important.
Absolutely. And things that you train a lot and drill over and over and over again, those start to become habits. And I recently read this book. It was called The Power of Habit. Highly recommend it. But I really related a lot of things that I read in that book to flying. Habits are incredibly important because I think when you get to a point where you're supposed to be doing something that is a habit and you haven't done it, something feels wrong. And it's not a thinking game, it's kind of a feeling game, and you start to feel that something's not right. So Dad, we've been flying every day for the last 2 weeks or so, just drilling things and going over everything to knock the rust off, getting ready for your instrument check ride. So how do you think your habits have changed, and how do you think they've benefited you? Because we've talked about checklists and procedures and all this kind of stuff.
To me, the big my benefit I feel most is what you often call muscle memory. Mm-hmm. Because as I know everybody knows, y'all are seasoned pilots. I'm pretty much a rookie in your footsteps, but there's a lot to instrument flying. There's a lot going on at times. And when you can deal with tasks consciously, but through muscle memory, that takes the weight off of you dealing with a situation you've gotten yourself into or that's come up, or controllers throw a little unsuspected command at you. Your muscle memory, like dealing with the 430 or G5s, it helps out to know that, keep that flow going so you can deal with the bigger things. That's one of the big things that's I've realized in my training.
Absolutely, and not only the muscle memory of knowing which buttons to push and all this kind of stuff in a familiar airplane, but procedures, right? Checklists.
Absolutely, yeah.
Personally, I feel wrong in an airplane if I have just made some sort of configuration change and I have not run a checklist in the last 60 seconds. Something feels wrong. And of course, my muscle memory then kicks in and I pick up a checklist. I say, that's what's wrong.
And even in a Skyhawk, I found that for instrument flying from the ground up, the checklist is invaluable to me.
Absolutely.
When I was flying VFR back in the 80s and 90s, flew a Skyhawk, I very seldom used a checklist at VFR. It was just so natural, everything's so natural, but IFR, I feel so comfortable with that checklist.
Absolutely.
It's my Bible.
Well, and it's that same concept that you brought up, Doug, when chaos enters the flight deck, which could be anything that's out of your norm. It could be that weird command that ATC threw at you where they say, proceed direct this fix, and you're like, wait, that wasn't on my flight plan. And now you're trying to think through this, and then you're dealing with a configuration change or whatever the case may be. So having those procedures, would you agree that has really helped you get your feel for how everything's supposed to flow? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Absolutely. I don't see how, and I'm just, again, flying a 172, somebody flying something more complex, it would just be a must. I don't see how anybody could survive without those procedures.
Absolutely.
And drilling.
Well, and that's why the big operators are operating big aircraft, commercial operators, 121, 135, a lot of that stuff's required. It's in your operation that you are supposed to use, a checklist and have certain procedures, and there are very detailed ways to do anything because it's the ritual that shows up during chaos that makes sense of the chaos. So, Martin, you talked a little bit about proficiency when we were discussing it earlier today. So how do you feel about proficiency and procedures and habits and how all that ties together as a CFI?
As a CFI and also as a pilot, these procedures and some standardized way of doing things are very, very important to me. I see it when I fly. When I go through the first steps of the checklist, it feels like my brain is being reprogrammed to fly the airplane that I'm sitting in. And of course, I know in theory what I have to do without reading it, but reading it, saying it out loud, helps me become more familiar, if that's the right way to say it, with the situation I'm in right then, and make sense of it and prepare me for what's to come. As a CFI, I've only been instructing for a few months. I just recently became a CFI, but flying with different students has shown me that even short of an emergency, when chaos unfolds, there is value in following a checklist and getting to something familiar and having that familiarity, maybe put yourself at ease and observing students that maybe get a little rushed trying to prepare for an approach and then think, oh, I don't have time for the checklist right now, I'll just do it by memory. They're usually not doing well in this. If you get something, and maybe it's not something on the checklist, it's just something else. Whereas the ones who take the time to go step by step, they seem to miss less and do better.
Because at that point, it's a ritual, right?
Yes.
It kind of helps solidify all of that. And we have our task management checklist, and I know I preach this with you all the time: aviate, navigate, communicate. The first step is to fly the airplane, or fly the helicopter, the aircraft. Fly whatever it may be, and get it away from the ground, right? I know you mentioned that too, Doug. And it's an incredibly important thing to have kind of that structure in those moments of chaos. So, Doug, what are your thoughts on how we as aviators in the community can help improve these concepts with proficiency and procedures and rituals?
Well, that's a really big question.
Absolutely.
As I said earlier, we don't rise to the occasion, we sink to the level of our most recent recurrent training. And we have data to prove if we wanted to reduce the accident rate significantly, we know how to do that. And there are good examples in aviation. The Mitsubishi and the R-22 helicopter both required mandatory by SFAR annual recurrent training. And when that training was implemented, the accident rate on both of those aircraft types dropped significantly. The same is true in the Cirrus. 10 years ago, the Cirrus was having a terrible accident rate. And while the Mitsubishi and the R-22 did it through regulation, Cirrus did it as part of their community. And they created a community where if you're a member of that community, the expectation is that you're going to participate in regular, informal, recurrent training. So we know how to do that. And I would argue if you fly a multi-engine airplane, you should do an annual flight review in a multi-engine airplane. And if you fly IFR in any airplane, you should do an annual review that includes an instrument proficiency check. Since I've been flying commercially since 1986, And most all of that, I mean, every 6 months I took a check ride, and most of that time I was a check pilot, which meant I took my check ride with the FAA. And having to go fly what's basically an instrument proficiency check every 6 months and being held to a standard, it becomes easy. Now I'm not doing that anymore, and now I'm going to have to have the discipline to force myself to do that on a regular basis.
Absolutely. And I think the difference between those two examples that you brought up, the Mitsubishi and the R22, and then the Cirrus, those are two very different ways that those problems were addressed. Which one, could you say which one you think is more effective, or do you have an opinion on that?
Well, my politics are very libertarian, and I like less government. But I also know my own personality, and if there isn't some sort of a requirement to do it, it's awful easy to take the shortcut. So, but as aviators, the only pilot we really have any effect over at the end of the day is the one we see in the morning in the mirror. And you just have to make a personal commitment to do the best you can, a continuous quest for quality improvement, and that comes through any sort of training, but recurrent training in the equipment you fly becomes really, really important.
Absolutely. And I think that is probably one of the most important concepts to remember, is that we are responsible for ourselves ultimately at the end of the day. And as aviators, we want to always look at what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, and always be willing to critique ourselves and call out our weaknesses when we think we're not doing as much as we could to stay proficient or stay on top of our procedures. That's one thing that I've really liked about being on camera so much on YouTube and stuff, is because I have the entire world to call out every little mistake I make. And it has made me a safer pilot over the years.
Many years ago, I wrote an article for Twin and Turbine magazine, and it was about the mirror, the pilot in the mirror. And one of the things that I mentioned in that article was that mirrors lie. Okay, so we're not very good at self-assessment. And so one strategy that you can use to help with your self-assessment is a mentor or a buddy, someone that you trust enough to be honest with you about where you're at. I've got less and grayer hair, and there'll come a time, and I fly a lot of high-performance airplanes, in air shows close to the ground. And there will come a time when I shouldn't be doing that anymore. And that mirror may not be completely honest with me, and I have to rely on my peers in the business and empower them to counsel me when that time comes.
I think that's very important, and I think that instantiates some of the cultural aspects that we referred to with the Cirrus example. Having a mentor or a buddy or somebody who's there to kind of help you realize those deficiencies, or when it's time to take a step back and reassess something. I think that is incredibly important. So, Dad, as a pilot who flies a 172 mainly for fun, and you kind of take a more leisurely approach to your flying in terms of how often you do it and all that kind of stuff, what are your thoughts on, and especially given your recent training with instrument stuff, what are your thoughts on how to improve proficiency and procedures? Do you have any ideas on how we can improve that?
Well, I go back to my early days of training, instrument training, and like we just said, muscle memory, proficiency. But my early days, controlling the airplane, keeping it on track, trying to put the approach procedure in the GPS unit on the iPad. ATC calls up. What do I tell them? What are they going to tell me? And then you say, what about your checklist? I don't have time for that. Okay.
That's what you were saying.
So we worked through that. And the muscle memory, I can do the 430 iPad. I know pretty much ATC procedures, so that's all a lot more relaxing now. And I look forward to the checklist to make sure that everything is just the way I want it. Everything's just the way I need it. And I think as far as your question goes, what would I see would better young aviators or people going into instrument flying or things of that sort is just what y'all have said. Keep proficient. Keep at it. Keep at it.
And I like what you just said about you look forward to using the checklist, almost because it kind of gets you on track and reprograms your mind, which is exactly what you just said, Martin. Is that kind of what you were saying?
It kind of takes the stress off me, so I don't have to sit there, what have I forgotten? Oh,
it's right there.
It's not on me, it's on the checklist here. I can just read that and make sure everything's done. And that's particularly true for prior to taking off, getting everything set up.
Absolutely.
I rely on the checklist. As you know, I kind of have my own custom checklist that helps me remember things, and in the flow that I like to do it as much as possible. And just so beneficial.
It's that one part of your flight deck that is the ritual that operates in the face of chaos. It takes away the mystery, and when all else breaks loose, it's there to kind of catch you. So, Martin, what are your thoughts? And also, not only from a pilot's perspective, but as a flight instructor, what do you think that we could do in terms of teaching? Not only how we could be better pilots, but also what can we do to teach more effectively and almost instantiate that cultural aspect and get people to want to better themselves and kind of have that cultural.
I think what you just said has to be the goal. People need to want to learn more. It's important that we all have learning goals. It's important that we look at a flight review or at a flight with a mentor or a flight instructor for other reasons as something fun and not as something painful, right? And I've flown with a lot of really good instructors. I've also flown over the years with some that I didn't have a big desire to fly again with. But the good ones, they make it fun. And I come out of this saying, hey, I can't wait to do this again. So as instructors, one thing we can do is make it exciting and make it fun, show people the value that it has, and understand, help them understand, help them realize that they come out of this with something they didn't know or couldn't do before, so that ultimately they will want to do it again.
Absolutely, and I look forward to kind of like you were saying, you look forward to the checklist because it forces you to kind of get back on track. And I really look forward to flight reviews and IPCs. I like getting IPCs done as opposed to just going out and doing my approaches, because I know somebody sitting in the right seat, a CFI, is going to catch something that I'm doing or not doing, and I'm going to walk away from that flight having learned something new. I'm going to be a better aviator because of it. And I think that's an attitude that has to be at the foundation of all of this before we can start bettering ourselves and nailing down our procedures, our rituals, and then our proficiency, getting proficient at those rituals. And I think flying a ton, as much as you can, is also what helps solidify those rituals into habits. And then it begins to feel wrong if you're not doing it. So I think these are all absolutely fantastic points, and I appreciate all the perspectives that we have up here on the stage. So I hope you got something out of this video. This is a topic that I am super, super passionate about. Accident prevention, procedures, and proficiency. I think it's one of the most important things we have in aviation as aviators and flight instructors to make our flying experiences better and safer, and overall just make everything better for the entire industry. So I really appreciate y'all being a part of this, Dad, Martin, and Doug. If y'all liked the video, give it a like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for watching.